Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. It's interesting how things can come full circle as we try to solve some of the more complex challenges. In manufacturing, regardless of your role, avoiding downtime is an obvious priority and one of the motivating factors driving investments in cybersecurity. In working to mitigate potential DDoS attacks or malware drops, manufacturers are tapping into more resources and heightening their awareness of vulnerabilities and the associated remedies, which can include updating access protocols, applying patches, and replacing old equipment and technology. The problem is that the solutions can actually contribute to the problem you were originally trying to avoid: downtime. So in following with that circular motion of problem solving I initially alluded to, the challenge is finding ways to patch, update, and secure operational technology without shutting down equipment or slowing processes. Our guest for today's episode looks to offer some solutions. It's my pleasure to welcome Gabe Dimeglio, VP of Global Security Services at Rimini Street, to the show. His company is a leading provider of data security and managed services. Well, hey, Gabe, thanks so much for joining us today and welcome to Security Breach.
Thank you.
Awesome. Starting off here a little bit and kind of weighing into your area of expertise, one of the biggest issues we have in manufacturing when it comes to cybersecurity is downtime. We're trying to get away from these dwelling attacks, these denial of service attacks, everything else that's encompassing that could possibly shut down or slow down a facility. But in order to secure everything, we also need to shut down and take care of some business there. So I was kind of hoping I could throw a couple of critical issues at you and you could offer some insight in terms of best practices, things you've seen, things of that nature. So maybe we could start out a little bit just talking about patch management. This has become a big issue in terms of understanding the best ways to initiate these patches, how to prioritize them, because the vulnerabilities can add up very quickly at times, and things you've learned there in working with customers.
Absolutely. So realistically, what it comes down to is everything's a balancing act, right? As we know. Patch management is one of many practices that organizations depend on and utilize in order to secure their platforms. Patch management, unfortunately, comes with its own challenges in terms of introduced downtime. And if you don't do it right, if you don't have proper change management controls in place, regression testing processes, if you're not mature in those regards, you're more than likely at some various point in time or many points in time going to run into self-induced outages, which is always painful. So the thing that I see a lot around organizations is they definitely have to introduce or maintain or increase ever so much a level of maturity around change control processes. Planned outages are ideally the way that you can balance those needs. But let's be honest, if you're talking about manufacturing and industrial controls in general, people want to keep the machine running, right? They want to minimize that as much as possible. And that's where you also introduce further risk if you don't have appropriate controls in place to accommodate that.
Yeah, definitely a balancing act. And you brought up a couple of interesting things there, too, about the maturity of an organization. And it seems like that really bleeds into culture and how cybersecurity needs to be embedded within the culture of an organization before it can really be embraced and put into place as effectively as possible. One of the things we're talking a lot more about lately is sort of the human element of cybersecurity as well. To really embrace and focus on that, that's another, for lack of a better term, it's kind of a time suck from an operational perspective. What have you experienced there in terms of organizations, maybe best practices again, getting to their people and talking to them about best practices and why we're implementing dual factor authentication and things like that to get them on board?
It's interesting. This is something that you've seen a bit of an evolution of over the last 20, 30 years, whereas, any time that you introduce something new or there was potentially a change that we would say was for the better, for the good, the end user experience, ultimately, you would find that there were challenges with the users, the actual consumers, especially if you're like a shop foreman, for example, right? I don't have time for that nonsense. I've got a business to run. But when it comes down to it, if you have executive support from the top down who truly believe in the value that these controls, and controls can be solutions, it can be processes, training, all those kinds of things. They believe in the controls, and that is the message they're pushing from the top down, then you're going to be in a situation where it's much more adoptable, if you will. The pain in transition is minimized. And if you don't have that pushing from the top down, living and breathing, kind of creating that culture, it's going to be very painful to implement any kind of changes.
Yeah, we hear that a lot and getting top, buy-in from the C-suite and all that. Let me just throw a scenario at you because we've got a lot of manufacturers, 75% of manufacturing in the U.S., fewer than 50 employees, a lot of small shops out there. So if you're talking to a CEO or an owner of a manufacturing organization, they're an engineer. They created the product. They know it forwards and backwards. They know it's the best thing on the market. And now you're coming and asking them for money to help defend data and IP and things of this nature. It's out of their wheelhouse a little bit. Have there been certain points that maybe you can hit on to help get them to get that buy-in that you're seeking?
It's interesting, right? So first off, most of the manufacturing base that we deal with are global. I mean, they're massive organizations. Not a lot of small mom and pop shops, so to speak. The small shops are in a position, by definition, the smaller shop means less complexity in what they're doing. They're in a better position to actually be agile or to introduce agility into their processes. The larger organizations is where you really run into those challenges we were discussing earlier. The main points that you want to hit on is really, if you understand, and you have to do this if you're going to go in and advise these organizations, if you understand the business, if you understand what their objectives are, you understand what's important to them, then realistically you're consulting with them around how to protect what is important to them. And quite frankly, the secret sauce piece is the part that almost all of them can relate to. Because while they may not be worried about a data breach if they don't have a lot of data per se, they generally are in business because they're producing something better than everybody else. They have something different in their model, and they want to protect that, right? They want to ensure that that doesn't end up compromised by a nation state sponsored organization. Like, for example, China is notorious for stealing intellectual property and then providing that to their manufacturing base to come and compete. That is the thing that most every one of these businesses has in common.
Yeah. Well, so you bring up China and some of the state-sponsored hackers that are out there. A lot of resources, and they're becoming a lot more complex in terms of the makeup of their organization and some of their tactics. Are you seeing anything right now? Is it the same game, different players type of thing, or have you seen tactics evolve in some way that organizations should be aware of as they prepare and put in place a lot of their defenses?
Tactics are continually evolving. Methodologies are evolving. The players are changing as time goes on. So for example, we used to see where hacktivist groups would be fairly organized, and they were considered a pretty significant threat, and they still can be, make no mistake. But compared to the evolution that we've seen in well-funded and highly organized criminal organizations, especially overseas, with who are doing things like ransomware deployments, they have evolved substantially over the last 5 years, right? The methodologies have evolved. The access to information and the tooling to enable them to go compromise an organization, shut down their manufacturing processes, and in turn monetize that. Easy monetization is always their motivation. That's evolved substantially. The attack methodologies themselves, not so much. It's the tooling that's available, it's discovered, and the level of depth and breadth of the programs and the skills that are behind those programs and the sheer volume. Those are the things that are continuing to evolve. Now, where it's different is on the nation state sponsored side. There's a continual evolution there. The skill sets are incredible. There's basically no lack of funding, which is the polar opposite of every business in the world, right? And there's ideology that also plays into that. And when you look at organizations, APT type programs, so advanced persistent threat type programs, where they're basically raising people from childhood and educating them all the way into working right into an APT team whose sole mindset is on continual evolution and penetration into businesses globally, that is a terrifying challenge that we face. And that is where you do see substantial advancement in attack methodologies, in finding and understanding weaknesses where the underlying vulnerabilities can be exploited, and they weaponize those things, kind of put them away, instead of typically actively deploying them immediately. So they're very mature about building entire systems of attack, not just taking the one thing that they bought somewhere and leveraging that to go deploy ransomware right now, right? It's a long-term play often.
Yeah, the patience of these organizations is equally impressive and frightening. It's really something. I'd like to get you mentioned about a lot of the tooling becoming much more complex. Is that a product of the fact that a lot of these organizations are very open to sharing information between themselves? Is it just the talent being drawn to sort of the hacker lifestyle or whatever you want to say, or what's going on there that's really helping them to continue to stay ahead of us when it comes to look at the complexity of some of the tools that they use?
If you look at a lot of the countries where ransomware is being deployed from, or other types of these activities occur from, they generally have some things in common, which is going to be that they have ideological motivations, but also, quite frankly, a lot of those countries are very poor, right? Poverty is a problem. And so when you can go and you can basically spend a portion of your quote unquote career learning how these things work, join a team, and become fairly wealthy rather quickly, that's motivation. So it's not quite the same as being in like the US and working on the shop floor and finding security interesting and wanting to go into it and understand defense and attack methodologies, where you're going to make a little more, but it's intriguing. A lot of times for them, it is simply, yeah, I would, right now I can't feed the family, and I want to have a nice house, and I want to be, fairly well off in the future, and this is the best option.
Well, and the people they're hurting aren't in their backyard either, so there's sort of a disassociation that they can embrace with that as well. Gabe, you've brought ransomware up a couple times, and we have this interesting dichotomy when it comes to the industrial sector in ransomware, because in a lot of areas, ransomware attacks are going down, or at least the number that are being reported are going down. The industrial sector, not so much, man. We are continuing to get pummeled with ransomware attacks, and I'm going to wager that the number that we know about and the number we don't know about are probably pretty equal. So it's still a huge, huge issue right now. What are your thoughts there in terms of, it's not if, it's when? How do you get ready for these things? How do you respond to them? What are some things that you've learned, I guess, in dealing with ransomware?
It is a matter of not if, but when. I would say on average, if you were to look at the long term, so over a decade, right? So not everyone's going to be affected immediately, but these methodologies will continue to evolve. And what we're seeing is there are some interesting solutions in the market to address recovery and response, but they're expensive, so adoption is low. So thus, we're going to continue to see this. Now, as long as it's easy to capitalize on someone's lack of process, or investment in controls, security controls specifically, that are designed to not only proactively protect against these things, but also enable rapid recovery, then you're just going to see this as a booming market. And unfortunately, in manufacturing or in critical infrastructure in general, it is very difficult, as most people know, to go and just upgrade equipment. That's not a thing you can really do. And in fact, in general, when people buy a machine, it's a 30-year machine, a 50-year machine, and the controllers that come with it are going to be the only thing on that machine, and they're going to be there until that machine dies. So then the question is, well, we're going to find weaknesses in the machine. How do we address those things as time goes on? And again, it's very complicated because there's no one size fits all solution for that. Yeah.
Well, it kind of leads into a conversation too. You mentioned tools before, and the hackers' tools are becoming more complex. There's a ton of stuff out there for the industrial sector or anybody who's trying to defend their OT landscape.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of perspective could you offer in terms of selecting from amongst these tools? Because it's great to finally get the funds, but then you've got a lot of different options out there, a lot of different ways to go. You don't want to be redundant. You want to make the right decision. As far as tool selection, what advice could you offer there?
Um, I'll start with the basics, right? So if you really want to validate that you have the right person, you've got to have some form of MFA. Ideally, you're also not trusting the source of any traffic, or in other words, you're going to segment off those communications or those systems. So we tend to find, obviously, in critical infrastructure that OT segmentation is taken very seriously. There's kind of a terrifying trend of new stuff that's all cloud connected for some reason, and people have their reasons for that. I understand that, but within reason, I can understand that. The problem is, once again, you're putting trust in someone else's controls somewhere else. In general, they will attest that they have these programs they're compliant to, but you really don't have visibility into the continual management. You certainly don't have control of that data interaction and the corresponding data that's flowing. So the only way that you can really protect that is through segmentation. I think that starting with those two areas, you have effectively mitigated, or at least greatly, substantially reduced the potential attack vector for those respective systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a ton of sense. Gabe, we've been talking a lot about the challenges. I understand there's some solutions in what you do at Rimini Street. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the company and some of the things you guys are up to.
Sure. So, Rimini Street is an enterprise software support provider, and will effectively think of us as like the large enterprise software IT shop, right? So, we solve the most complex problems around things like Oracle, SAP, IBM software. So, the stuff that's actually running the business. We have a ton of clients that are obviously in manufacturing or critical infrastructure, for example. And again, a lot of those systems are segmented off. Now, from a security perspective, I have a large global team, and we continually advise our clients on securing not just the systems that we support, but all of the things they talk to. So, OT systems, of course, right? And we also provide security solutions and services. And it's interesting. I was listening to one of your podcasts earlier, and it just so rang so true. It used to be that we had RS-232 out there plugged into all these controllers, and you would just simply go ahead and develop your program, run the program, repeat. And at some point in time, Sun was very effective in getting Java to the market. Oracle now owns Java. Java's everywhere, right? Billions of devices around the world. Um, okay, so if you have a web interface on a system that you're going to use to program this device and it's Java based, that's not a good idea by any standard nowadays, right? Most people are looking at other programming languages and respective runtimes to actually, I'll say, by design, create a more secure system. So what do we do about that? So we have a lot of clients that are running Java. They're running web services all over the world, all the major ERPs, financial systems, HR systems, you name it. Almost all this stuff's running Java. So from our perspective, we actually do what's called runtime integration into those environments. So what we actually do is we teach the compiler how to find its own weaknesses, how to find the things that we're aware of that are problematic in the respective platforms and fix them automatically. So it's a little bit different than your external control, like a WAF or some other type of proxy-based solution. It's integrated into the runtime. And it does exactly what the gentleman on the podcast said. Okay, it no longer takes 2 seconds to start up. Now it takes 12 seconds to start up. Very true. Startup is slowed down, but then the continual runtime is unaffected. So it's a great approach across the board for, we'll say, Java-based systems. But that's an example. So we provide virtual shielding capabilities, database security that's very extensive. So database is really going to be more applicable to the control systems or the business systems that are interacting, not necessarily. Well, actually, we have a ton of manufacturers who have databases that are measuring or being used to store the data of the measurement processes that are used in manufacturing consistently. So you look at some businesses where they say, hey, I'm producing XYZ gadgets, and I'm making 100,000 of them a day per factory, and they're not equal. We have lasers and temperature sensing equipment and everything to monitor the progress along the way. That information is stored in databases, so it's critical to secure and protect those databases.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about all the different connection points that are out there. You've mentioned a lot of the legacy equipment that's going to just always be in place. That's just the dynamic of the industrial sector. But we're also introducing new technologies into some of these legacy systems. We've got, as you just alluded to, more and more data coming into the enterprise that we're using on an hourly basis. So basically, we've got more endpoints, we've got more connections, we've got more inventory that we need to take up and understand our full assets out there to secure them all. That's another one of those things that takes a lot of time to do, and a lot of industrial enterprises almost skip that step, which should be the first thing that we do in trying to get things secure. What have you seen in terms of trying to allocate the time or the significance and the importance of just getting that inventory down first?
I mean, look, at some point in time, to your point, it's painful. That's why people avoid it. At some point in time, you got to rip the bandage off, right? You really need to do that. Or how in the world are you going to protect what you have when you don't know what's actually there? There are ways that you can inventory this kind of stuff, that you can find any type of digital connection that exists within an environment. Look, we have the OSI model, and we understand everything from hardware addressing all the way up through layer 7, application-based communications. So if you have even remotely modern network infrastructure, you can see what's on there. You can record that activity. You can study and assess that activity, and you can effectively document what's communicating where. And the best part is you can actually use radius or other mechanisms to prevent new things from connecting, right? Like, you have the ability to do that. So to me, I've never really understood why people don't rip the Band-Aid off. It again becomes it's just not the priority, but it is the right thing to do if you're taking this seriously.
Yeah.
And more I am seeing organizations that are taking this seriously, so I'm happy to see that.
Yeah. Well, another one of those Band-Aids that needs to get ripped off, because nobody loves sitting around a conference room putting things together, but going back to the it's not when, it's if, preparing response plans. That's another area where the industrial sector continues to struggle, because it's a hard thing to really grab onto, knowing you're always vulnerable in some way, shape, or form, and being prepared for when something does happen. Again, your perspective on taking the time and putting that together.
It's funny because some of the most important elements of a response plan are super templatized, super simple. Your friends who are working for a competitor, probably because you have, I hate to say it, but the enemy, my friend's enemy, we all have the same common interest here. We're all trying to accomplish the same goal. There's elements of this stuff that's shareable, that we should get from user groups and other conversations. And frankly, the FBI and other organizations will give you guidance on how to do that. And realistically, every response plan should take into account what are the things that can go wrong. You're not the first person or the only person who's going to solve that problem. It is just a matter of prioritizing. But again, you can start with a templatized approach. And by the way, start with the basics. The basics are, if all hell breaks loose, where's the plug that I unplugged from the wall, right? And then what are the phone numbers I call? Right. So response plan should have your contact information. It should have the cell phone number for your, let's say it was ransomware. It should be your local rep from the local field office for the FBI. You should have someone who's a member of InfraGard, who's a part of these conversations on a fairly regular basis. The local law enforcement authorities and how to contact them in the event of an emergency for any of the respective locations that these operations are occurring. You should have availability to any of those assets and have pre-built some relationships in response. Simple. Now, then it comes down to the playbook. And the playbook is the harder piece. But again, this problem's been solved time and time again. If something bad goes on or is occurring, what is the thing? What are we seeing? And thus, what's the response to that thing? It's one of those things where it's so much better. I mean, the experience is just so much less stressful when you have a playbook in front of you that people know and understand and can follow, as opposed to trying to figure it out in the moment.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great point, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, as you said. The amount of templates that are out there, and in addition, InfraGard's a great resource. CISA has stuff out there, and pretty much any automation or software vendor you're working with has something in place that may not be the answer, but they've got a place to help you start and figuring out the right way to go. So absolutely, the resources are out there. That kind of leads into one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, Gabe. There has been, over the last, I'd say really since Colonial Pipeline, maybe a little bit before that, there's been a lot more public exposure to a lot of these attacks and things that are going on. I would argue the benefit of this has been there's been a lot more transparency in how these attacks have taken place, why the hackers were successful, etc. Ideally, that's led to us learning a little bit more, and hopefully some of that transparency will continue. Have there been certain things in working with your industrial customers that you've seen them doing better or learning from in a lot of these cases?
Absolutely. But let me back up to the point that we're seeing more of this. Frankly, I believe that a lot of that is because it is required from a regulatory perspective. I mean, to this day, most organizations don't want to air dirty laundry. So the fact that there are regulations in place that require or mandate reporting, and they're getting stricter and stricter globally and even regionally, by industry even, mandating stricter reporting of these incidents and how they could affect the consumer base or customer base, that's a big deal. Now, the result of that, of course, is that people are understanding that if something happens, we have to report it. We better have a playbook on doing so. So now PR campaigns are a part of response playbooks, for example. But yeah, the bottom line is because nobody wants to be the next name in the news. Um, every time something like this happens, someone in the same, vertical, same business effectively, those board members walk in, they go, what are we doing to ensure this doesn't happen to us? So there's visibility that has driven change, but it's a combination of regulatory required change as well as just sheer risk understanding, or we'll say it's the evolution, if you will, because think about this, man. 20 years ago, security didn't have a spot at the table. If
Right?
you said, hey, we're at risk, you know, your CEO would laugh at you and say, no, dude, I'll tell you what risk is. I'm signing an attestation that's going to the SEC, and if this thing's inaccurate, I'm going to jail. That's risk. You telling me that
Yeah.
some dude's going to put something on my computer that's going to read my email, that's not risk. That has changed,
Yeah.
right?
No, it's interesting. I never would have thought the impact of the SEC on cybersecurity would be so incredible. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really everything that's being learned from some of these larger companies that do get hacked. I think about the Johnson Controls one that took place about was that about 8 months ago, whatever it was. I mean, it's a perfect case study for segmentation, and there's been lots of others as well. I hope that that continues to happen, and it kind of brings up the question of is government involvement, regulation, whatever you want to call it, do we need more of that? Are we at the sweet spot right now? How does that continue to play a role in cybersecurity?
Um, we don't need more, we need better regulation. So the problem
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
if you look at the continual evolution of these regulatory programs, you'll see that there's maturity that's growing within those programs around the requirements. They used to be very um, checkmark based, right? It was like, here's your list. Go do everything in this list, and otherwise we're gonna basically hit you with these fines. So companies would literally evaluate, well, it cost me this much to do this. Is that less or more than what the fines are going to be if I don't do it? Right. That's one thing. Because it was actually not necessarily solving the problem for them, and risk at that point and these controls were not understood from a business context. Like, how is this actually helping my business by doing this thing I'm being told I have to do? So the maturity of these programs that I love seeing over the last several years is that instead of being a very prescriptive based approach, it's more risk management or intent based control requirements. So if the intent is that I want to prevent the exploitation of vulnerabilities, instead of saying, hey, you have to patch these systems within this timeline, it's you have to prevent the exploitation of these vulnerabilities, right? Because that's really the intent. Is how do you prevent that thing from becoming leveraged or being leveraged against your organization in a negative way? That's honestly because there are technologies, even in financial services. Think about it, right? The AS400 is still the world's greatest calculator. You can't go and apply um, anti-malware controls in the same way on an AS400 as you can in a Windows-based system. So where it was previously a checklist, it's okay, look, we think of it this way. We're trying to solve for this problem. Here's a way that is known to that used to be on the checklist that's kind of the easy button, but it's not always the easy button. So how do you achieve the same goal in a different way? And you get to think through that and make those decisions and measure the efficacy of those controls. And then you can actually have those conversations with the auditors. That's what we need more of. And the reason being, if you mandate to me that I have to go and implement these exact controls or run my business a specific way, that may very well be detrimental to my ability to actually secure the organization. The intent is security, but not, there's no one size fits all as mentioned. So I can actually, because of this change in the way these regulatory standards are starting to move, make better decisions that are going to provide higher risk reduction value by investing in other areas that are going to still achieve those same goals, the intent of the controls that were previously mandated very prescriptively.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there has to be an element of support in there as well, or some remediation focused part of that regulation, not just make it punitive, because I think the scary thing is this could become more like OSHA, where they're in there levying tons of fines. Company pays the fine but doesn't really solve the problem. And that's the equivalent of a live off the land cyber attack. I mean, that's essentially what that could become and what we want to avoid. Getting kind of wrapping things up here a little bit, Gabe. If you've listened to the podcast, you know these are pretty standard ones to wrap things up, but what are some of the bigger trends that maybe you see coming down the pike?
Realistically, when it comes down to it, I actually align quite a bit with some of the analysts in the space, just because the conversations are flowing that direction. So I think that from a top level down, you're going to see that C-levels are mandated to ensure that they're taking security seriously. Whereas right now, there's some level of that, but it's going away. I think you're going to see board members that are going to have responsibilities assigned to their role and their function around cyber as a growing trend, right? You see it here and there, but it's not the majority. I think in 5 years, that will be the majority of boards will absolutely be focused on this. From a control perspective, the concept of the endpoint being gone, that's true, but we still are not the endpoint, but the perimeter being gone, that's true. But we still have a perimeter, right? We still have to focus on that. I think the industry needs to focus on simplification of solutioning, simplification of the utilization and implementation of controls, because right now they're complicated and people are struggling to achieve the goals they want to because they don't have the resources, the skills in-house. It's very expensive. So this is an industry failure as far as I'm concerned. We're going to see, unfortunately, people addressing the skills gap by hiring low-cost resources who don't have the background or the depth and breadth of knowledge that they really should have to be highly effective in a true risk mitigation or management kind of role, more checklist operator type things. But you are going to see higher quality coming out of educational programs where they're developing this future talent and candidates, because there is a continual back and forth, or I'll say kind of a communal relationship between private industry and the education sector around ensuring that we're starting to develop these skills appropriately. So it's going to be a little bit of a rough hurdle to get to a better place, but we're headed that way if we can figure out how to continually measure and address risk as it evolves, do it faster, be more agile effectively.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great point about simplifying things. It kind of gets back to that human element that continues to permeate everything about cybersecurity. As much as we focus on all the technology behind it, still human beings enforced with it. Thanks, Gabe. And for more information on the work he and his colleagues are up to, you can check them out at RiminiStreet.com. Also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Gabe Dimeglio, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.